They say airports are where stories begin. That afternoon, mine began with cold steel around my wrists. The absurdity would have been funny if it wasn't so damn humiliating. The cuffs bit into my skin as the security officer, name tag reading Keller, yanked my arms behind my back like I was some street criminal. I could feel eyes burning into Mephisangers stopping mid-stride, mothers pulling their children closer, murmurs snaking through the air like wildfire. My captain's wings pinned to my chest seemed invisible to everyone except me. "Sir, you're making a mistake," I said, keeping my voice level. Years in the cockpit taught me that panic helps no one. I'm scheduled to fly Flight 272 to Boston in 40 minutes. Keller's grip tightened. "You think a uniform makes you untouchable? I've seen your type before." "Your type." Two words heavy enough to drag the oxygen out of my lungs. I'd heard them whispered before, spat before, weaponized before, but here, in front of 100 strangers, they cut deeper. Somewhere beyond the crowd, the airport's PA crackled. "Final boarding call for," but the announcement drowned beneath the buzzing in my ears. I wasn't just being detained. I was being displayed. I caught my reflection in the terminal's glass wall, shoulders squared, jaw locked, eyes refusing to drop. I'd worked my whole life to be the man in that reflection. Son of a Tuskegee airman. Top of my flight school class. Hours logged over war zones most people couldn't spell. And yet here I was, reduced to nothing more than the color of my skin. Keller pulled me toward a side corridor. "We're going to do this quietly," he muttered. Quietly. Every smartphone in the terminal was already aimed my way. I saw a teenager holding his phone high, angling for a better shot. My name would be trending by dinner time, though maybe not my real name. Online, I'd just be black pilot arrested at JFK. We passed gate 14 when I heard the voice sharp, commanding, impossible to ignore. "Keller." The crowd rippled like someone had dropped a stone in still water. Heads turned. People stepped aside. And there he was, Admiral Thomas R. Keating, U.S. Navy, storming through the terminal like a warship breaking through ice. His white dress uniform gleamed under the fluorescent lights, ribbons catching every flicker. His pace was fast, but his eyes were faster, locked on Keller like radar on a target. I'd met him only once before, at a joint training exercise in Norfolk. But that one meeting was enough to know. Keating didn't walk into situations unprepared. "What the hell is this?" Keating's voice carried over the terminal hum, over the rolling suitcases, over my own heartbeat. Keller hesitated, like a child caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "Admiral, sir, this man." "This pilot," Keating cut in, stepping so close I could smell the faint salt of ocean wind clinging to his uniform, "is a decorated officer and a damn fine aviator. Remove those cuffs. Now." Keller's jaw flexed. "Sir, with all due respect, I had probable cause." "You had prejudice," Keating snapped. His words were sharp enough to slice through the thick air between us. "And I don't tolerate prejudice on my watch. Not in my Navy. Not in my country." For the first time, I saw Keller falter. His hand twitched toward the key at his belt. But his pride was still fighting. "Admiral, I—" "Do it," Keating said, his tone a quiet threat. The cuffs clicked open, and the weight lifted from my wrists physically, at least. My skin bore the red marks. My uniform bore the wrinkles. My dignity, well, that was harder to smooth out. The Admiral didn't just stand beside. Mayhay stepped slightly forward, a shield between me and the 100 curious eyes. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, addressing the crowd, "you've just witnessed the difference between suspicion and honor. One is born of fear, the other of respect. Know the difference." A hush fell over the terminal. No one moved. Even the PA seemed to hold its breath. Keating turned to me, his voice dropping. "You okay to fly, son?" I nodded. "Yes, sir." "Good," he said, clapping my shoulder. "Then go show them what professionalism looks like." As I walked away, every step felt heavier and lighter at the same time. He had given me my freedom back, but the world outside that terminal hadn't changed. Not yet. But maybe, just maybe, someone in that crowd would remember what they saw today. And maybe, the next time prejudice reached for its cuffs, it would hesitate. Keating's presence lingered even after he strode off toward the security desk, presumably to file a report that would make Keller wish he'd stayed in bed that morning. My hands still tingled from the cuffs' ghost pressure, like they were still there. The murmuring crowd began to disperse, but not before a few people approached me. A middle-aged black woman in a floral dress touched my forearm. "We saw everything," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry." I wanted to tell her she didn't need to apologize for someone else's ignorance. But before I could speak, she gave a small nod and hurried away, pulling her rolling suitcase behind her. Then came the teenage boy with the phone. He didn't say a word, just handed me a folded slip of paper with his number and the words, "Video of the whole thing. Use it if you want." His eyes darted toward Keller, still standing rigid by the corridor, jaw locked in silent fury. I slipped the paper into my pocket. My captain's uniform suddenly felt like a costume in a play where the script had been rewritten without my consent. I had a job to do, but the last 30 minutes had shifted something inside me. Walking to gate 16, I felt the stares. Not all were hostile, some were curious, some sympathetic, but all were heavy. Each one reminded me that for some people, my uniform would never be the first thing they saw. The cockpit was my refuge. When I stepped through that narrow doorway, the world outside shrank to dials, switches, and the soft hum of avionics. My co-pilot, First Officer Grant, glanced up from his pre-flight checklist. "You okay?" he asked, brow furrowing. "I'm fine," I lied, sliding into the captain's seat. Grant looked unconvinced, but he didn't push. That was one of the many reasons I respected him, knew when to speak and when to let silence work its magic. As we prepared for departure, my mind kept wandering back to Keller's voice. "I've seen your type before." I wondered what type he thought I was. The kind that couldn't possibly earn their stripes without some backroom favor? The kind that looked suspicious simply for existing in a space too many believed we didn't belong in? My father's voice echoed in my memory. "They'll question you twice as hard, son. So give them twice the reason to respect you." We were 30 minutes into the flight when I heard the ding of the cockpit phone. It was the lead flight attendant, Marissa. "Captain," she said, her voice lower than usual, "you've got someone who wants to speak to you. Says it's urgent." "Passenger issue?" I asked. "No, more like a military issue. And sir, it's Admiral Keating." I blinked. "He's on this flight?" "Yes, sir. Seat 1A. He asked if he could step into the cockpit when convenient." Grant shot me a look. "That guy's following you." "Or maybe," I said, "he's following up." Keating stepped into the cockpit with the kind of controlled presence that made even the narrow space feel like a formal briefing room. He didn't sit, just stood between our seats, his hand resting lightly on the back of my chair. "First of all," he said, "you handled yourself back there with more restraint than most men would have." "Thank you, sir." "Second, I'm not letting this slide. Keller's been on thin ice for a while. I've filed a formal complaint, but I need your statement to back it up. When we land, I'll arrange for someone from my office to meet you." I hesitated. "Sir, I appreciate that, but—" "No buts, Captain. If you let people like Keller operate unchecked, they'll just keep getting bolder. I've seen careers derailed because good men stayed silent." Something in his tone carried the weight of personal history. I glanced at Grant, who was pretending to focus on the instruments but was clearly listening. "I'll give the statement," I said finally. Keating's expression softened just a fraction. "Good man. And if I may, your father was Colonel Harris, wasn't he? Flew in Desert Storm." "Yes, sir." "You knew him?" "Knew of him," Keating said, a faint smile ghosting his lips. "He saved more pilots than you could count. Men like him paved the way for men like you. Don't forget that." With that, he left the cockpit, leaving behind the faint smell of starch and determination. By the time we landed in Boston, my nerves were buzzing. True to his word, Keating had arranged for a Navy legal officer to meet us. Lieutenant Commander Elena Brooks was waiting at the gate, clipboard in hand, her uniform immaculate. "Captain Harris," she greeted me with a firm handshake. "I'll make this quick. Admiral Keating wants your statement while the memory's fresh." We found a quiet corner in the crew lounge, and I recounted every detail: Keller's approach, his words, the crowd, the cuffs, Keating's intervention. Brooks wrote in neat, decisive strokes, occasionally asking for clarification. When we finished, she looked me in the eye. "You did nothing wrong. This isn't going away quietly, Captain. Not this time." Her words should have felt reassuring. Instead, I felt a knot tighten in my chest. I'd been through this cycle before: incident, report, investigation, then silence. Would this be any different? The answer came 2 days later, when the video surfaced online. Not just any video, the teenager's footage. Clear, steady, and unedited. Keller's words your type rang out with poisonous clarity. Keating's rebuke echoed just as loud. By noon, the video had over 2 million views. News outlets called. Old squadron mates texted. Some offered support. Others warned me to brace for the storm. The airline issued a statement condemning discrimination and praising my professionalism. The airport authority announced an internal review. And Keller? He'd been placed on administrative leave, which was bureaucratic code for we're figuring out how much trouble you're in before deciding if we cut you loose. But the real flood came from strangers' messages from black pilots who'd been mistaken for baggage handlers, from Muslim flight attendants pulled aside for random searches, from passengers who'd seen things and said nothing until now. One message stood out. My son wants to be a pilot. He's 12. He saw your video and said, if he can do it, I can too. Thank you for not giving up. I read it 3 times. The knot in my chest loosened. It wasn't over. The hearing would be public, and Keller would have his chance to spin the story. But I had my truth. I had witnesses. And I had the Admiral, a man who didn't just step in because he could, but because he knew what it meant to be the shield. The day of the hearing, I walked into the conference room in full uniform. The place smelled faintly of coffee and tension. Keller sat across the table, his lawyer at his side. Keating was already there, his mere presence enough to tilt the balance of the room. When it was my turn, I spoke plainly, not with anger, but with the clarity of someone who's flown through storms and knows how to keep the nose level. By the end, there was no doubt about what had happened. And when the verdict came, termination of Keller's employment, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like correction. That night, I sat in my apartment, watching the city lights blink below. The world hadn't transformed overnight. Racism hadn't evaporated. But something had shifted, if not out there, then at least in me. Keating had once said men like my father paved the way. Maybe now, in some small way, I'd helped clear a little more of that path. And maybe, just maybe, the next time a black pilot walked through an airport terminal, the only thing people would see first would be the wings on his chest. The days after the hearing felt like flying through unpredictable crosswinds. On the surface, I was back to my routine flight schedules, pre-checks, and flight announcements delivered with my usual steady tone. But beneath it, the world had shifted. Everywhere I went in uniform, I could feel it. The longer glances, the strangers who recognized me from the video, the occasional thumbs up in the terminal. Some were quiet gestures, a quick nod from a baggage handler or a smile from a gate agent. Others were bold, a passenger who insisted on shaking my hand after a flight, telling me, what you did, it mattered. I'd thank them politely, but inside, I felt conflicted. What had I done, really? I'd just been in the wrong place at the wrong time, and had the right man show up to shield me. Keating had been the one to stand between me and the weight of the system. And yet, here I was, being treated like a symbol. The media storm didn't help. One network invited me for an interview. I almost said no, I wasn't looking to be paraded around like some trophy in the fight against racism. But my sister, Dana, called me from Atlanta. James, she said, you don't get it. This isn't just about you. That video, it's hope for a lot of people. You go on that show, and some kid's gonna see you and think, if he can do it, so can I. Dana had that way of slicing straight through my excuses. She'd been doing it since we were kids. So I agreed. The studio lights were blinding, and the set smelled faintly of makeup powder and coffee. The host, a woman with the kind of calm smile that made you trust her, asked me to recount the events. I told the truth, just as I had in the hearing. No embellishment, no dramatics. But then she asked, do you think what happened to you was an isolated incident or a reflection of something larger? The easy answer would have been to dodge, to say, I can't speak for others. But my father's voice was in my head again, urging me to face into the turbulence. It's part of something larger, I said. And pretending it isn't, that's how it keeps happening. The uniforms we wear, military or airline, they should be shields. But prejudice can cut right through them if we don't stand up for each other. The interview aired that evening. By the next day, my inbox was flooded: pilots from Europe, cabin crew from Asia, military personnel from all branches. Stories poured in, some far worse than mine. One from a retired Air Force colonel stuck with me. I thought we'd fought these battles already. Turns out, we've just been flying the same route over and over. 3 weeks later, I got a call from Keating. Captain Harris, he said, I've got a proposition for you. How do you feel about speaking at the Naval Academy's Leadership Conference? I laughed softly. Sir, I'm a commercial pilot, not a motivational speaker. You're a leader, Harris. And leaders don't hide in the cockpit when there's a lesson to be taught. Think about it. I didn't need to think long. The Academy's auditorium was filled with crisp uniforms and sharp young faces, all focused on me as I stood at the podium. I told them about the terminal that day, about the cuffs, about Keating's intervention. But I also told them about my father, how he'd taught me that leadership wasn't just about command, it was about protection. When someone abuses their authority, I told them, they're not just targeting one person. They're eroding the trust we all rely on. If you stand by and do nothing, you're letting that erosion spread. Sometimes leadership means stepping forward when it's not your turn to speak. Sometimes it means standing between someone and the storm. When I finished, Keating joined me on stage. He didn't say much, just shook my hand in front of them all. But I could tell he was proud. Months passed. The video's buzz faded. The headlines shifted to new scandals and stories. I thought maybe the whole ordeal was finally behind me. Then, one rainy afternoon at Logan International, I saw him. Keller. He wasn't in uniform. His hair was longer, his shoulders slouched. He stood in line at a coffee stand, clutching a worn leather jacket. For a moment, I considered walking past. Let the ghost remain a ghost. But something in me refused to. I stepped into the line behind him. He turned, eyes widening when he recognized me. Captain Harris, he said, voice flat. Keller. We stood in silence until he blurted, You got me fired. I shook my head. You got yourself fired. His jaw tightened. You don't know what it's like. Every day on the jaw pressure from upstairs to keep things secure. They tell us to look for threats, but they don't tell us exactly what that means. We make calls in the moment. You made a call based on skin color, I said, my tone calm but unyielding. And that's not security. That's profiling. He looked down at his coffee order slip. I've been doing security work since I was 20. I don't know how to do anything else. It would have been easy to walk away then, to let him sit in the mess he'd made. But my father's lessons came back again. Justice without empathy can curdle into bitterness. There's training out there, I said quietly. Programs that teach real threat assessment, not snap judgments. If you're willing to learn, you could still work in security. The right way. He didn't answer, but his shoulders seemed a little less rigid when I left. A year later, I got a letter. It was from Keller. He'd completed a de-escalation and bias recognition course. Was working as a security supervisor for a hospital now. The letter was short, but the last line stuck with me. You didn't have to talk to me that day. You did anyway. That mattered. I folded the letter and slipped it into the same box where I kept my father's flight logbook. Looking back, I realized something. The day in the terminal hadn't just been about a racist officer, an admiral's rescue, and a public hearing. It had been about the chain reaction that follows when one person decides not to look away. Keating hadn't looked away from me. I hadn't looked away from Keller. And maybe Keller wouldn't look away from the next person who needed someone to step in. The storms we face aren't always the kind you see on radar. Some are quieter, more insidious. But they can be navigated if someone's willing to grab the controls. And I've made up my mind. As long as I'm flying, I'll be that someone. The following spring, I received an invitation that felt almost surreal. It was from the Department of Defense, co-signed by Admiral Keating himself. The Navy was dedicating a new training facility for joint military-civilian flight operations, and they wanted Minute as a pilot, not as a guest, but as the keynote speaker. When I called Keating to ask why me, his response was short and clear. Because, Harris, you've already taught more people about leadership than most officers do in their careers. This is just the bigger stage. I wasn't sure how to respond, so I just said, I'll be there. The morning of the ceremony was crisp, the kind where the air tastes clean enough to make you feel awake from the inside out. The facility was sprawling state-of-the-art simulators, classrooms, even a hangar with a retired F/A-18 Hornet polished to mirror brightness. The crowd was a mix of uniforms and suits. Cadets, airline executives, military brass. And at the front row, Keating, his white uniform gleaming like he'd ironed it an hour ago. I stood at the podium and looked out at them, remembering my father's words. They'll question you twice as hard, so give them twice the reason to respect you. I told my story, not the viral video version, but the whole thing. I spoke of the quiet humiliation in those first moments, the roar of the crowd's judgment, the calm fury of Keating's intervention. But I also spoke about what came after the conversations, the hearing, even the encounter with Keller. Everyone in this room, I said, scanning their faces, has power. Maybe it's the authority of a badge, the command of a cockpit, or the respect that comes with rank. But authority means nothing if it isn't used to protect, not diminish. The question isn't whether you'll see injustice in your lifetime. You will. The question is, what will you do when it's right in front of you? The room was silent when I finished. Then Keating rose, and the applause rolled in like distant thunder building into a storm. After the ceremony, Keating and I walked through the hangar together. You know, he said, running a hand along the smooth fuselage of the Hornet. Your father once told me something when we crossed paths years ago. I stopped. You met him? Briefly, Keating said with a faint smile. He told me, flying is the easy part. It's landing with your integrity intact that's hard. I swallowed hard, the weight of those words settling deep. Months later, on a routine cross-country flight, something happened that brought those words rushing back. We were somewhere over Kansas, clear skies, when a young boy knocked on the cockpit door. His mother, just behind him. Marissa, our lead flight attendant, explained that the boy, maybe 8 years old, wanted to meet the pilot. I turned in my seat. Come on in, kiddo. He stepped inside, eyes going wide at the panels and controls. But his gaze kept coming back to me. You're the pilot? He asked, as if needing confirmation. Last I checked, I said with a smile. Why? He shrugged, looking almost embarrassed. I didn't know pilots could look like you. The words hit me like a soft punch to the chest. I knelt down so we were eye level. They can, I said. And they do. You can be one too, if that's what you want. But it takes work. A lot of it. You ready for that? He nodded solemnly, like I'd just sworn him into something sacred. His mother mouthed a silent, thank you, before they left the cockpit. After the flight, I sat alone in the terminal, watching the boy and his mother disappear into the crowd. And I realized something. That moment, quiet, unrecorded, unseen by the world, meant more than the viral video ever could. Because change doesn't just happen in hearings or headlines. It happens in the small exchanges, in the conversations that leave a mark without anyone noticing. That night, I pulled my father's logbook from the shelf. I'd read it cover to cover countless times, the neat block letters detailing altitudes, headings, and weather conditions. But tonight I noticed something I hadn't before. At the back, a single page with no flight data. Instead, it read, one day, you'll be flying through a storm. You won't see it on the radar, and there'll be no instructions from the tower. But you'll know it when you're in it. And when you do, fly steady, son. Keep your wings level. Someone's counting on you to bring them home. I closed the book and sat there in the quiet, the hum of the city outside my window sounding a little like an engine at cruise. The next time I saw Keating was at his retirement ceremony. The Navy had turned out in full force, medals, speeches, handshakes. When it was my turn to speak, I kept it simple. Sir, I said, you once told me leaders don't hide when it's not their turn to speak. I think everyone here knows you've lived that truth. But you also taught me something else, that when the storm hits, you don't just hold the controls. You steady the person flying next to you. He gave me that same faint smile I'd seen in the terminal, the day he'd stepped between me and the man who thought a pilot's worth could be measured by his skin color. After the ceremony, as the sun dipped low over the harbor, Keating shook my hand one last time. You've got the stick now, Harris. Don't let go. I never did. Years later, I still think about that day in the terminal, not with anger, not even with triumph, but with clarity. It was the day I learned that the real measure of a flight isn't just how far you go, but who you help get there. And somewhere out there, maybe a young boy is looking up at the sky, really believing that he can be the one holding the controls. If that's the only legacy I leave behind, then I've landed with my integrity intact. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.